러시아 연방에 대한 우크라이나 당국의 모험적인 무력 침공을 격퇴하기 위한 쿠르스크 지역 해방 작전이 승리적으로 종결되었다. 조선민주주의민공화국 국가수반의 명령에 따라 쿠르스크 지역 해방 작전에 참전한 우리 무력 구분대들은 높은 전투정신과 군사적 기질을 남김없이 과시하였으며 대중적 용주의와 무비의 용감성, 희생성을 발휘하여 우크라이나 신나치수 세력을 소멸하고 러시아 연방의 영토를 해방하는 데 중대한 공헌을 하였다.
Chief of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces, General Valery Gerasimov, announced the complete liberation of the Kursk region. While it is true that the Ukrainian armed forces remain in certain border territories, Ukrainian troops no longer fully control a single settlement in the Kursk and Belgorod regions. Moreover, the Russian armed forces have occupied a large area in the neighboring Sumy region. At the same time, Russian troops continue their offensive in several directions on other fronts in Ukraine. The most difficult situation for the Ukrainian armed forces is around Toretsk, where the Russian armed forces are trying to break through to the north to the city of Konstantinivka. Meanwhile, US media, the Wall Street Journal to be precise, warns that in the coming months, the Ukrainian armed forces will run out of artillery ammunition from the United States. The Wall Street Journal wrote, citing Austrian military analyst Franz Stefan Gadi. According to Gadi, American ammunition will most likely run out in the next few months, and it is unlikely that Republicans will approve a new aid package for Kiev. If this happens, the Ukrainians will have to reduce the rate of fire, which will make it much more difficult for the Ukrainian armed forces to defend their positions. The day before, former Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmitry Kuleba stated that Kiev can no longer rely on the United States, even in the medium term. So gents, I'm doing back-to-back videos. Given the momentous events in Kursk, this report will focus on the likely consequences of Ukraine's defeat in Kursk, both on the front line with a brewing crisis near the Toretsk and Konstantinivka sector, as well as a speculation from a Russian expert as to how this might affect Zelensky's continuing power as Kiev's leader. Now, my friends, if you wish to support independent media like mine, I ask that you consider a super thanks or PayPal donation, and most of all, stick around to the end screen to see a trailer for my membership program, which is perhaps the best way to support my work and get value for the money. If you want to see exclusive analysis that you won't see in the algorithm, as well as combat footage and news clips, check out the membership program. Links are in the description, and let's get into it. After several weeks of fighting, Russian troops have occupied the Gornal-Nikolaevsky Belgorodsky Monastery near the Sel River and advanced to the village of Gornal, right on the border. The Russian Defense Ministry reported on the occupation of the village, and a video has appeared of the military raising a flag in its northern part. However, it is not clear who controls the surrounding area. Northeast of Gornal, on the other bank of the Sel, there are probably Ukrainian armed forces positions still in the Kursk region. To the west of Gornal, the Russian armed forces entered the border village of Oleshnia. However, Ukrainian troops also continue to be present in the forests around the village. To the west, Russian troops do not control the border strip on the Sema River opposite the village of Tetkino. However, the Ukrainian armed forces also do not have permanent control over this area, which is cut off from the main territory of the Kursk region. To the southeast of Gornal, fighting continues near two villages, Popovka and Demidovka in the Belgorod region. The Russian Defense Ministry claims that the villages captured by the Ukrainian armed forces in March have been completely liberated. For several months now, Russian troops have been trying to break through to the village of Yunakovka in the Sumy region, the main logistics center of the Ukrainian armed forces between Sumy and Sudzha. The offensive is being carried out from three sides. From Basovka, which was captured by the Russian armed forces, heavy fighting continues there for the small village of Lokhnia. from the border along the Suja-Sumy road, and from the northwest from the side of the village of Zhuravka, which was captured by the Russian army. The Russian armed forces clearly do not have enough forces to quickly break through to Yunakovka, which would deprive the Ukrainian armed forces of the ability to continue combat operations in the border area. Most likely, most of the group that stormed Suja in March has already been withdrawn to the rear. The same can be said about a significant part of the Ukrainian units that previously operated in the Kursk region. Probably, after being replenished, these forces will be transferred by both sides to other sections of the front.
Тут морская пехота танковая.
Так, посмотрим.
The 8th Combined Arms Army of the Russian Armed Forces has once again captured almost the entirety of Toretsk. Of the entire Toretsk agglomeration, only the western part around the village of Shchebinovka remains under the control of the Ukrainian armed forces. The Russian army is trying to encircle Shchebinovka with strikes from the southwest through the village of Sukhaya Balka, which is occupied by the Russian armed forces, and the east from Toretsk itself. If the Ukrainian armed forces are forced to leave the village, the Russian armed forces will reach the western end of the Kleban-Bik reservoir, beyond which lies the city of Konstantinovka. In addition, Russian troops are making their way from Toretsk and its eastern outskirts to the eastern end of the reservoir. Despite the losses they suffered during the attacks, they have consolidated their positions at Pleshivka and on the outskirts of Dalchevka. The advance of the Russian armed forces towards Konstantinovka from the east, that is, along the Pokrovsk-Konstantinovka road, continues, albeit at a slow pace, where another division of the 8th Combined Arms Army is operating. It was able to occupy part of Tarasovka and, having repelled the counterattacks by the Ukrainian armed forces, part of Berezovka south of the road. These attacks could weaken the Ukrainian defenses in Chasiv Yar, where another Russian offensive has stalled in recent weeks. The Russian offensive is likely to resume soon, which could lead to the threat of enveloping Konstantinovka from the east as well. In fact, on the 28th of April, Ihor Fursov, a platoon commander in Ukraine's 109th Brigade, shared the increasingly dire situation in the Toretsk sector, where Russian forces are ramping up their use of drones. He shared this information with Romadsky Radio. In quotations, "The situation in the Toretsk sector is the most critical among all areas of the front line. Nothing is changing. The Russian enemy is doing everything it can to power through. Sometimes it's just a few orcs, which is a negative term for Russian forces and Russians who support the war. Sometimes more," he said. "They are using drones to the maximum extent, including those with fiber optic control and drones of various types. The enemy's situation, tactics, and strategy remain largely unchanged. It's just that the concentration of their efforts in this area is very high," he said. He was asked how was the concentration of Russian efforts changed. He answered, "It's hard to say. From what I see on our drone displays, it has increased 5 to 10 times in our sector. We're seeing a lot of those so-called motorcyclists. People in the rear might laugh at them, but for us, it is no joke. It is not that the Russian enemy's army has been so badly depleted. It's that when you have to move through a 10-kilometer zone near the front line, any fighter would prefer a motorcycle over heavy armor. Motorcycles are more maneuverable. They give you better visibility of the surroundings, and they make it easier to spot drones," Mr. Fursov explained. According to the platoon commander, the nature of the war has changed drastically. In quotations, "Very few people truly realize it yet. Even the military leadership hasn't fully adapted. But the Russian enemy now has a huge number of drones. Before, there were drones, but not in such overwhelming numbers. Now the critical mass has arrived. Drones capable of flying 10 to 15 kilometers, and this has completely disrupted our logistics and in general. Previously, even 15 kilometers from the front line, we could bring in people and volunteers with MPs and excursions. For example, in the town of New York, which is in the Donetsk region, just a few kilometers from the front. Of course, we wore helmets, and it was dangerous, but I could go there and back 10 times. visit the guys at the positions, handle various tasks. Now he says that is simply impossible.
Сходили мы на что, блядь. Откатиться не можем.
The Russian armed forces, despite counterattacks by the Ukrainian armed forces in March and April, were able to hold the defensive line south of Kursk. At the same time, the Russian army continues to advance westward in the direction of the village of Novopavlovka, an important communications hub for the Ukrainian armed forces. To the south, Russian troops are trying to once again create a threat of encirclement of the Ukrainian armed forces group that previously defended Kurakhove. This group has already been forced to retreat twice with losses due to the Russian armed forces coming to its rear. Now a new threat is brewing. Russian troops are trying to cut off the Ukrainian armed forces supply routes near the village of Bogatyr by striking on both banks of the Volcha River. Fighting is already underway on the outskirts of the village.
Сейчас где-то здесь в посадке въебало. Уж кого-то гоним. Скорее всего, к нам пытаются подобраться, блядь.
Now in another article from Russian media, they asked a pair of veteran Russian military observers to comment on the development's strategic and symbolic significance, that is, the Russian liberation of the Kursk salient. Kursk region's complete liberation is a powerful blow to the image of the Kiev regime and, in general, attitudes of the Ukrainian population and military towards Zelensky and his orders, veteran military and political observer Evgeny Nikolaev says. The Kursk gambit was a political decision with the supposed aim of holding onto territory in order to somehow negotiate with Russia, Nikolaev recalled. Now Ukraine has not only lost this key bargaining chip, but faces the threat of Russian forces freed up for operations on other fronts. In quotations, we have liberated our territory and will now direct all efforts to the creation of a buffer zone. What it will look like and how wide it will be is a big question, because the longer the Kiev regime continues to oppose peace talks, the more territory Russia will take, thereby becoming stronger in the negotiations process and weakening the capabilities of Ukraine's Western partners in negotiations, Nikolaev emphasized. Nikolaev has no confidence in Zelensky's ability to reach peace, pointing to his continued rejection of Crimea and the new Russian territory status, refusal to engage in direct talks, and rude behavior during his meeting with the US sponsors in Washington earlier this year. Ukraine's defeat in Kursk could accelerate internal turbulent processes, and Zelensky may simply disappear, replaced with someone who would suit Russia, Ukraine, and Ukraine's partners in the negotiations process, the observer believes. Everything is already heading in that direction. From the liberation of Sucha in March to Saturday's announcement of the total expulsion of enemy forces from Kursk region, the Ukrainian army's Kursk gamble has proven an unprecedented defeat and one that could ultimately help lead to peace, military observer from Russia, Sergei Poletayev, says. In quotations, the sudden and rapid liberation of Sucha was a serious defeat for the Ukrainian armed forces, and a defeat of a new kind. Their front has never collapsed on such a scale, not counting February 2022, when there was no front as such. This will have far-reaching consequences, Poletayev explained. Saturday's announcement and the fact that we have reached the border and not a single Ukrainian soldier remains on our old territories carries more of a symbolic meaning, making the formal and complete failure of Ukraine's incursion, according to the observer. Now that the Kursk region has been freed, Russia will have the opportunity to create a security zone on the other side of the border through gradual advances into Sumy. Operations in Kharkov region, where Russia has advanced 10 to 12 kilometers into areas with road infrastructure to prevent large Ukrainian formations from approaching the border, it served as a preview of the military's next steps in Sumy. The fact that we have the opportunity to destroy the front like this, I think, might influence Ukraine's pliability, particularly when the Sucha experience begins to be replicated in other parts of the front, Poletayev stressed. With Zelensky continuing to reject Russia and the US's peace overtures, only major defeats can accelerate Ukraine's desire to negotiate, the observer remarked.